Hey, I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'm going to show you how to install these Racetech gold valves on your dirt bike. So what these Racetech gold valves are going to do for you, you're going to get plusher suspension, more bottoming resistance, and you're going to be able to set up your valve stack exactly how you want it for your type of riding and your specific needs. So with this, they're actually not that hard to install. If you can replace your fork seals, you're probably going to be able to replace these out as well. So your average rider can do this, and you're just going to want to refer to your model specific service manual, the instructions that come with this kit, and this video. You should be able to do it. We're installing them on a 2021 Honda CRF450R. This has the twin chamber forks, and this is going to be a similar process for most late model dirt bikes, even if you have the separate function forks. Now, if you have a standard cartridge or open cartridge style fork, you know, that's a little bit older style, but this should still be able to help you get it done. But again, refer to your model specific service manual and the instructions that come with your kit. For parts, we're installing new fork springs, and you can figure this out by checking your race sag, and then if the free sag is off, that means you're going to change your rear shock spring and your fork springs, or you can type your information into the DVS sheet, and all that is, that's going to tell you what shims you're going to use with all these valves and the correct spring rates. It's going to tell you everything you need to know about setup. So the stuff is not a mystery. They've figured it out for you, and you're going to get an access code with these gold valves. So these are the gold valves themselves. These two are the compression. These are the rebound. And then when you're in here, it's a good idea to be replacing your fork seals and inspect your bushings, make sure they're in good condition. And then of course, we have some ultra slick fork fluid. To do this job, you may or may not need a drill and drill bits. That depends on your DVS sheet. Then we're using safety glasses, rubber gloves. We have a tape measure, suspension cleaner, waterproof grease, a little bit of Loctite, and a ratio right. Now we're also using a few picks. That's going to help keep track of our shim stacks. You want a 1/4 inch and 3/8 inch drive torque wrenches. Then we're going to use digital calipers, some common hand tools, and then we have fork specific tools. So we have the Racetech shaft holding tool. We're going to use that along with our vise, and we also have soft jaws and a drain pan. And then these are the fork cap tools. So we're going to have two on our bike, and then we also have a cartridge holding tool on the other end of this fork cap tool. And we're also going to be using some files. We need to file down some peening, and we're also using some feeler gauges. We're going to start out with a clean bike, and some of you guys, if you don't have a suspension vise, you're going to have to loosen up these fork caps before you remove the forks from the bike. So you'll loosen up this upper triple clamp. And then you'll loosen up that fork cap, and then we can go ahead and remove the forks. All right, even though we washed our bike before we removed the forks, we still have some dirt and grime on them, so we're just going to use a rag and a special tool, toothbrush, to clean all that up. Now before we take the forks apart, we're going to count the clickers on our adjusters. And to do that, all you're going to do is turn these adjusters clockwise, count each click until they lightly seat, and then back them all the way out counterclockwise. Now chances are your DVS sheet will have you do a different amount of clicks, but the main point is to have these backed out all the way counterclockwise for compression and rebound. Next, we're going to put the fork in our vise. Now you're going to need either soft jaws, or like us, we have these Racetech suspension soft jaws, and that allows us just to clamp this tube in here. But if you don't have these, you can just clamp that axle holder on the bottom of the fork. So at this point, we're going to loosen up this fork cap. Then we're going to dump all of this oil that's in the fork into our drain pan. You can see we have that bleed hole, a bunch of oil's coming out of that as well, so make sure that's facing down. All right, so once most of that's out of there, we're going to temporarily reinstall this cap, and we're going to clamp this axle holder in the vise. Now when you clamp this axle holder in here, you want to make sure that the fork tube doesn't get damaged by your vise. So I've just folded up a couple of rags just to protect that tube. Then we have a center bolt in the bottom, and it's a 21 millimeter socket on ours. And once you have that broken loose, you can put your drain pan underneath here, because you're probably going to get some oil coming out of there. And we're going to press down on the fork cap and install this cartridge holding tool. Next, we're going to take our 17 millimeter wrench, hold the jam nut with it, and break the center bolt loose. Before this is all the way off, I'm going to lay out a couple rags and start laying the parts out on the rags. So then we can finish unscrewing that center bolt, and there's going to be a little push rod or D-rod. Pull that out as well. And we're going to press down on the fork cap again and let that cartridge go back into the fork. So now I've moved the drain pan underneath this fork cap, and we're just going to unscrew it again. Let some of that oil drain out for a second. Then we're going to remove this cartridge. All right, so the next thing we need to do is remove our fork spring. And at this point, if you want, you can hang this fork upside down for a little bit of time, let all that oil drain out. We're not going to take this apart any further because this is a brand new fork and we know the bushings and seals are fine. But if you have very many hours on your bike, it might be a good idea to watch one of our fork seal replacement videos and get the seals and the bushings replaced. Next, we need to remove this jam nut from the bottom of the damper cartridge. So to do that, we're using our Race Tech shaft holding tool. You don't have to use this if you clamp this in your soft jaws. Just be really careful with it and make sure you don't damage it or flatten it out. So once that jam nut's off, you just want to check around these threads, make sure you don't have any really sharp areas. If you do, you can use a file or a little emery cloth or something to kind of smooth them out. And then before we push this damper rod through, we're actually going to apply grease to these threads, but we have a few steps before we do that. So I'll go ahead and remove this from the vise. So once you've done that, you're going to remove this bushing assembly from the cartridge. You've got a couple washers underneath that. And we're going to flip this over, and I'm just going to lightly clamp this in the vise. You don't want too much pressure on it. Then we're going to use our fork cap holding tool and another cap tool to loosen the compression assembly of this cartridge. And we can push up on that damping rod. That's going to help remove our compression assembly. I'm actually going to hold on the end of that damping rod while I remove this, and that way it doesn't pull the damping rod through before we have the grease on those threads. So we'll set that on our rags, and then we're going to dump all this fluid into our drain pan. You just want to pump that damping rod up and down, and that's going to help get all the oil out. Now real quick, I'm going to spray off this damping rod. Then we can apply some grease to these threads. So once you have some grease on the end of the shaft, you're just going to push this through the seals. Now we're going to take the damping rod and use our shaft holding tool again and clamp this in the vise. And the end of the shaft is going to be peened, so we need to remove the peening to remove that nut. We're just going to use a file to take the end of the shaft down till it's flush with the end of this nut. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and remove the nut. I'm just going to use flat blade screwdriver and just lift up on this piston and the whole valving assembly. That way I keep everything together and don't lose it. It's a good idea to take your file and clean up the end of this shaft once you've got all that stuff removed. The next thing we need to do is remove this piston from this compression assembly. So we're just going to clamp this cap in our soft jaws. Just be careful not to scratch anything. The first thing we need to do is remove this peening. Now on WP and Olin's forks, you're not going to have this. Same thing on the damping rod where we removed that rebound piston. You're not going to have to file that down on those forks. Once you have the shaft filed down flush with the end of that nut, you can go ahead and break it loose. And there is a chance we might break this whole piece loose. So if that happens to you like it did for us, we're just going to have to take one more step. We're going to remove this all the way. Now we're going to install this back into the vise, and just be careful that you don't clamp onto the piston and then remove the nut. So again, I'm just using a screwdriver, and we're going to move these piston and shims up and just keep them all in order. Then again, we're going to clean up this compression shaft with the file. So at this point, we're going to use a little suspension cleaner to clean all the metal filings off of all these parts, and then we're going to start laying out our new parts. So on our rebound piston, we're actually going to be drilling a bleed port into it. Everybody's setup will be different. We're just looking at that RVS sheet, and we're drilling on the rebound piston on the rebound side. So the rebound side has the 3 ports, and the mid valve side has the 6 ports. So make sure you're drilling on the correct size or correct side. We're just going to very lightly set this into our soft jaws. It's just helping me hold it in place, that's all. And to help you out, you can actually use an auto centering punch. So we're just going to punch in the middle on that side, and then we're going to be really careful when we drill this to make sure we don't break that bit. So you can see when we drilled that out, we only went through this first edge right there. Now we're going to do the same thing to the other rebound piston, and we're going to spray them off with some suspension cleaner when we're done. Now before we install our compression valve onto the compression assembly, we need to get this back together. So we've cleaned all the parts off. This piece, it had all that Loctite in there. I made sure I cleaned all that out. And this seal, I applied some grease to that, and the side with the O-ring, it's going to be facing down. So we'll go ahead and slide this into place. Be careful not to damage that seal. So that's good. We got some grease on these threads, and we are using a permanent type thread lock on these threads, so we need to make sure there's no grease left on these. So I'm going to wipe that off and spray it down with some contact cleaner. All right, so we have the base of our compression assembly. I'm going to clamp that in the vise. So I'm going to apply Loctite to the shaft. Wipe off the excess. And we're going to screw this into place. And we're going to finish tightening it with that fork cap wrench that also acts as the cartridge holding tool. And one thing I forgot to mention is, there's some washers that go above the spring, so make sure those are there on yours. Now the way we did this, everything's probably perfectly fine, but just in case some of that Loctite dripped down in the threads and got in these orifices on this low speed compression adjuster, I'm just going to blow some air through these holes and make sure they're free and clear. Now real quick, before we go any further, I want to talk about the difference between the stock piston and the gold valve. So Racetech's whole deal, it's all about oil flow, and you're going to have more oil flow with this gold valve, and that's how you can get more adjustability with all the shims. So if I lay these down, this is the rebound side of the compression pistons. That's that check valve on the back side. So you can see the gold valve, you're going to have a ton more oil flow. And again, that's why you're going to be able to come up with your own shim stack and control how much oil is actually flowing through here. All right, to get these gold valves set up, we have our DVS sheet printed out, and we did bring a couple of old parts from our old compression valve assembly. So we have this base plate. This is just going to give us more options. We'll explain more about that later. And then this check valve, we are not going to be able to reuse from the old assembly. It's a larger outside diameter than the new check plate that comes with the kit. So we're going to get that out of the way. Then we have our sleeved washer and our wave washer. We will reuse those, as well as the retaining nut at the top. And everybody's retainer might look a little bit different. Some of these are going to have a collar on them, but whatever it is, we're going to be using some red Loctite that came in our kit. So with all that being said, we're going to start building our valving stacks. So on this particular fork, we're going to have 4 different valve stacks that we're going to make. Now with this, if we look at this compression valving stack, the first number we're looking at is the quantity of shims that we're going to use. So this is 3 of the same. They're going to be 0.15 millimeters thick. And then the last number is the outside diameter. And you can use a digital caliper to take these measurements. So if you move down, this is all in descending order from the valving surface. Next one, we're going to have 10 of the same shim. And then after that, you don't see a number here. So that's just going to be 1 of each of these shims in descending order. When it comes to assembling the shim stacks, you want to make sure you take your time and use some digital calipers to get everything measured out. There's a ton of shims that come in these kits, and you're not going to use all the shims. So you want to make sure you have the correct ones in your bike. To make sure you get everything set up correctly, you want to stay organized. So it's easiest if you write down the numbers for each stack on a piece of paper and then put the specific shims next to those numbers. So that's what we've done. We have all 4 stacks laid out. Now sometimes you might run into some shims that have 4 different numbers. So you have your quantity, your thickness, your outside diameter. The last one is the inside diameter. And the reason that's important on this one is because the rest of these shims have that 8 millimeter inside diameter. Now that we're organized, we're ready to put these shims onto our valves. So one thing we're going to do is we're going to clean these off, because you might have noticed these don't come perfectly clean. We had a bunch of little flakes on ours. So I'm going to start with the smallest shim, and you can put this on a small screwdriver or a pick. And we'll put that all in order, spray it off, and then what we can do is set this onto the valve, and that allows us to push the stack onto the valve with everything in order. Now, as far as these valve stacks go, we have this single stage compression stack, and then some of these are a 2-stage stack. Now, if you want to know more about suspension theory, you can check out the Racetech Suspension Bible. It's available on our website. But in this video, we're just focusing on getting all these stacks installed onto our suspension. All right, now we're ready to start assembling everything. So we're going to start with this low-speed valving stack. Just going to slide everything into place. Make sure that sits all the way down. Then we're going to install a base plate. We might have to add an additional base plate later, depending how thick our stack is. Then we're going to install our compression stack with the tapered side facing down. Might have to rock these back and forth a little bit to get them all worked on and lined up. Next, we'll install this O-ring onto our piston. And then once you have that on there, just keep in mind that your DVS sheet might have a bleed hole that you need to drill in this piston. If it does, make sure you do that, or make sure it's pre-drilled, one of the two. Ours actually is not going to have that. And again, this compression side, this has the 6 ports that seal against that shim. So we're going to have the compression side facing down. After that, we can install the check plate. After that, we have our wave washer, and then we have our sleeve washer. And you want to make sure all of this is centered up. So this check plate, if it's not centered on there, it's going to be trapped and it's not going to work right. Once you have the sleeve washer and spring washer all lined up and that check plate centered on there, you want to press this down, and we're looking right at the end of the shaft. So if we put our nut on right now, we'd actually run out of thread and we'd have a little bit of space between the sleeve washer and the nut. So to fix that, what we can do is either add shims to the base plate right down here, or put a thicker washer on the base plate. Or for us, what we're going to do is install a washer on top. And all we're doing is making sure we no longer see that flat portion of the shaft and that the washer is above those threads. All right, so now we're going to take the Loctite that came in our kit, apply it to our nut, and we're going to torque this to the spec that came with the DVS sheet. Every bike, again, will be different, so make sure you refer to your specific torque. Ours happens to be 15 foot-pounds. A couple things when you install this: make sure you don't get any Loctite down in any orifices, and make sure that check plate is lined up correctly. Once you have that torqued, again, you want to make sure the check plate moves up and down. So ours does, we know we're good. Now before we move on to our damping rod, I'm just going to hold the shim stack up to the light, and we're going to check our single stage stack for any gaps. There shouldn't be any. If you have a 2-stage stack, you're going to see a gap at that crossover shim and nowhere else. And if everything looks good, we can go ahead and move on. Now again, on our Rebound piston, we did have to drill a bleed hole in it. And if you have any burrs, you can remove those with a small file. So this one, we're just going to carefully go on the outside. You don't want to damage the piston. Just make sure you remove any burrs on that. Then we'll clean the inside up with a small round file. All right, first thing we're going to do on our damping rod is put a base plate on. So we've just got one of those thicker washers. We've got the sleeve washer next, and I already have that spring on there. Now for the mid-valving stack, we're going to install one shim at a time. The first shims we're going to install are these sleeve extender shims. They're the 6mm inside diameter shims. Let those fall into place. Now for the 8mm inside diameter shims, those sit on the spring and they're actually going to go around that sleeved collar. So you'll put one on at a time and just hold them down. Now with all that in place, don't put too much pressure on these shims. You don't want to bend them. Now we can install the gold valve. So again, these 6 ports that seal against the shims, those are going to be facing down. Once you've done that, you can install the Rebound shims. After that, we'll install the Rebound base plate. All right, so looking where our base plate is in comparison to the end of the shaft, we need to raise this up just a little bit. So we've got bigger shims that are larger in diameter than the smallest of the Rebound stack. So I'm going to go ahead and set these into place. And I can reinstall the base plate. And that ensures we're not going to run out of thread on our nut. So this setup should be good with us, but before we torque everything down, or before we do the final torque on everything, I'm just going to temporarily install this nut. Now with our nut temporarily torqued down, we're going to check the valve float on the mid valve. We're just going to use a feeler gauge. Spec on ours is going to be 0.3 millimeters. So I'm just going to go from the biggest shim on the mid valve in between that piston, and you want to go all the way to the center of the rod. So we're measuring 0.35 millimeters. So those 6 millimeter inside diameter shims that we had down here, we actually need to change those until we have the correct float. So ours actually totaled 0.35 millimeters. So we're going to change it and put a 0.3 millimeter shim in there, and that should correct our problem. So we're just going to remove these 3 smaller shims. And again, we had one 0.15 thickness and 2 0.10 thicknesses. So that's 0.35 millimeters. We're just going to replace those with a 0.3 millimeter shim with the 6 millimeter ID. Then we can install this shim onto that sleeved washer, install the spring, and then we'll go ahead and install the shim stack. And we can reinstall the piston, making sure the compression side is down. And we'll reinstall the rebound valve stack and the base plate. After that, we're going to temporarily install this nut again. Double check that what we did was correct. Now to check that we have the correct valve float, I'm going to try to insert the 0.3 millimeter feeler gauge. Goes in there, has some slight drag. So we're correct there. We're going to install the correct nut and torque it down to 30 inch-pounds with some Loctite. Again, that torque spec is going to vary depending on what suspension you're working on. Once you have that nut torqued, you're going to want to remove any excess Loctite. You can even use some compressed air, blow through that. And then you're going to want to inspect the shim stacks. Again, make sure there's no gaps. Make sure this piston is on there nice and solid and it can't move. And then again, make sure that mid valve, that you have the correct amount of float on there. So everything is looking good on ours. So what we're going to do is grease the end of this rod, just right on those threads. And then we've got some fork oil I'm going to put on that piston ring. Then we're going to install this damping rod into the cartridge assembly. Lower that down into place. And we're going to line up the bottom of that damping rod. And then we're going to push it through using a 10 millimeter T-handle. So then we're going to extend that all the way. We have this jam nut that's going to go on the bottom. But I'm going to clean this grease off first. And make sure this collar is going up towards that cartridge. So once you've done that, we can go ahead and put the cartridge assembly in the vise. And just to double check everything, you can make sure this goes up and down all the way really smooth, which ours does. We're just going to really gently clamp that in there. So we're going to go ahead and fill this up with 243 cc's of 5-weight fork oil. And we're going to pour this into our damper chamber. So typically you're going to leave this in your vise, but just to show you guys, you're going to pump this damping rod up and down several times, and to make sure that the fluid doesn't cavitate, you can pull it down really slow. And you want to keep pumping this damping rod until you can't hear any more air bubbles in this system. And even when you've worked all those air bubbles out, it's a good idea just to let this sit there for 10 minutes or so and let any more bubbles rise to the top. Now before we put the compression assembly in, I'm going to dip it in some oil. This is just going to help in the bleeding process. So once you've done that, make sure that that damping rod is is fully extended. Then we're going to install this compression assembly. And the whole point is to keep any air out of here. So this is actually going to be kind of hard to install at first, and we're actually going to be pushing out any excess oil. So for that reason, you want to make sure you have a drain pan underneath. All right, so on this fork cap, we don't have the option to torque it. So what we're going to have to do is just snug it up. But if you do have the option to torque this cap, I recommend it. So now we need to do the final bleeding on our cartridge. So to do that, we're only going to move this, maybe 4 inches. You can do that 10 times. Make sure you have all the air out of the system. All right, once you have that done, we're going to go all the way down with this cartridge, and that's going to push out any excess oil out of the top. So just make sure you're ready to catch all that oil in your drain pan. Once you have the oil drained out, we're going to do one more test. So all I'm going to do, press this all the way down and make sure that that rod extends all the way on its own. If you can pull on the rod and it actually goes out further, then you know you have air in this chamber and you need to go through the bleeding process again. The next important thing we need to do is set the preload on our fork spring, or check to make sure it's correct. So this fork spring, this one is different than the stock one. They're not always going to measure the same length as stock. And this is the specific spring for the weight of our rider. So to check this fork spring preload, I'm going to install the spring into our fork tube. And then on the cartridge, we're going to reinstall that spring seat. So we'll go ahead and slide this into place. And I'm going to slide this down until the spring seat is in firm contact with the spring. So that's sitting right there. I've got this outer tube all the way down so the dust seal is resting on that axle holder. And that's just going to make sure we have a consistent reference point. So what you need to do now is preferably you'd have a tape measure that you can measure millimeters with. And you'll measure from the fork cap to this outer tube. And then write that measurement down. And what we're going to do is we're going to install the center bolt, and once everything is installed, we'll take the same measurement and subtract that from the first measurement, and that's going to give you your spring preload. All right, if your preload is not within specification, say you only had 2 millimeters of preload or 2.5 millimeters of preload, these shims or washers that come with the springs, they're about 1.5 millimeters thick. So we could add one of these. You want to remove the cartridge and the spring, put this in the bottom, make sure it's fully seated down towards the bottom of the fork, and then put everything back together, make sure this cures your problem. The other thing you can run into, maybe you had too much preload and you need to take some away. So maybe you had 7 millimeters of preload. To reduce the amount of preload, we actually have a clip on this cartridge. So this is that upper spring seat. And if we move this clip to the upper groove, that's going to take away some of that preload. So those are some of the adjustments you can do to get that in the correct spot. Preload is super important if you want your fork to feel right. If the preload isn't right, chances are it's going to feel harsh. So we're going to push down on the cartridge and install the cartridge holding tool. Next, we're going to install the push rod. So this has a D shape to it. So we need to make sure this flat side is lined up on both ends. So up in that cartridge, we need to line it up. So first, I'll line up the center bolt. I'm going to let that bottom out, and then I'm going to rotate it until this falls into place. So right there, it just lined up. I can screw it all the way on, and we're actually going to torque it against the jam nut. Now with the center bolt, you need to make sure that it's all the way bottomed out on your damping rod before you tighten up the jam nut. Then you can take your 17 millimeter wrench and tighten the jam nut down onto the center bolt. Then we're going to do two more things. We're going to put a drop of Loctite on those threads on the center bolt, and then a little bit of lube on that O-ring. So we can go ahead and remove the cartridge holding tool. And then this one gets torqued to 51 foot-pounds. So we can then take our second measurement, and if this is out of spec, then you can make your adjustments, and once you're done, just make sure you double check it and make sure everything's correct. Now for our fork, we actually had 7 millimeters of preload, so we did have to take everything back apart. We're going to move this clip. We're trying to get ours at 5. You can find your preload on your DVS sheet. And just make sure it's fully in its groove, which it is. Now we'll reassemble everything and double check it. So we're barely over 4 millimeters of preload on this, but you know, chances are you're probably not going to get it exactly spot on. So we're going to call that good, and we're going to fill this fork with 370 cc's of oil, and then we'll reinstall the fork cap and set our clickers. If you don't have suspension vice jaws, you can torque your fork cap once these forks are installed on the bike, and you want to check your service manual for the spec. All right, once you have this fork done, you can go ahead and do the same steps to the other fork. Once you have your forks back together, you can reinstall them on the bike. Don't forget to torque down your pinch bolts on your triple clamps, and then make sure you center your axle. If that is pulled in, your suspension is not going to work right and it's going to bind up. So we've got a video on that, as well as how to set up your clickers. So be sure to check out both of those videos. Now, even though you know the shims we put in here, that's probably going to be pretty close to what we need, you may need to adjust your clickers. So that's why I mentioned that video. And if you can't get the setup you want by doing that, you can go back in there and change some shims out. So that's all there is to installing these Racetech Gold valves. If you need them, be sure to pick them up on our website and subscribe to our channel for more helpful content. Thanks for watching.